What up, Wizards? It's Dev from The Place. You know, Aetherdrift has been out for about 3 weeks now, which is, the way I tell time, is basically a month, the same thing, right? And the set is still kind of a massive joke in the broader community. If you do a video about how much you like the set, you know, maybe hear me out. I'm going to do one in defense of Aetherdrift. You get 6-7K views, which is respectable. If you do a video about how much everyone hates Aetherdrift, you're going over the moon, baby. 100K plus views on that one because everyone absolutely loathes this set. But you can do as much as you want to, but you shouldn't make the mistake of letting that translate into how seriously you take the set in a competitive environment. That's because the set is actually doing the thing, man. I've got a mind-blowing 38 cards written down, and there may actually be more than that I've seen show up in everything from Mtg 5.0s and challenge results all the way up to the top 8 of the Pro Tour. So whether you like it or not, Aetherdrift is lapping a bunch of other sets in terms of standard relevancy. So today, let's take a look at every card from Aetherdrift that's seeing play.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
And we're back. Hey, before we jump in, just do all the YouTube stuff. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Just hit the thumb button, sub to the sandwich if you haven't done it yet. And if you want a special greeting in each video, check out the Patreon link in the description. And for existing patrons, here's your special greeting. Hey, I hope your day was all right. Tell me all about it. And just in case it wasn't good, I made hot chocolate. All right, you feeling welcome now? You comfortable in your seat? Well, let's go ahead and get to it and start our engines today with a bunch of cards that have shown up a few times. These are cards that I'm calling show up sometimes. That's what I've got written in my notebook at the very least. These are not cards that you see in like every League 5.0 result or every challenge result or anything, but occasionally they'll pop up in a build or two. For one, I've seen Pit Automaton at least a couple of times hiding out in this weird little Enigma Jewel deck that also uses like Repurposing Bay. More on that card later. But yeah, this dude shows up as some ramp for that deck from time to time. He's obviously not amazing, but if you miss your Enigma Jewel on turn 1, this guy will do it for you on turn 2. And if your start includes both of them, you can almost activate any ability in the game of Magic starting on turn 3, and that seems like pretty good juice. There's also Lumbering World Wagon, which I see a little bit more often than Pit Automaton, but still not a whole lot, and when I do see it, it's a silver bullet in the list it's involved in. It looks like it's mostly in domain decks to replace like Topiary Stomper, but again, it's just the one of basically every time I see it, so it might still be in tryouts right now, and I'm not really sure it's going to end up getting that jersey. We've also got Bulwark Ox showing up like more than I would have thought, and not in any sort of mounts deck like you would assume, right? This is just in like red-white aggro decks a good bit of the time. It, you know, triggers Valiant when it actually targets a guy, and I kind of like that. So there's a few things about this that are kind of solid, and it's just a decent creature in and of itself, so I'm not surprised to see it show up. It's just where it showed up that I'm a little shocked by. I've also seen Gas Style Thrill Roller more than once, if you can believe it, by which, by the way, I mean I've seen it exactly twice. Once as a 2-of in a mono red deck, another time as a 2-of in a Boros aggro deck. So Boros is really, these last couple of cards, throwing a few noodles against the wall to see what's ready to eat. Now again, I'm not sure any of these cards we've looked at survived tryouts, much less this one, but it makes sense in theory against a bunch of decks that are packing a million removal spells and sweepers, and the fewer Sunfalls we play, in the more split-ups and Day of Judgments, which is a thing that is happening, the better cards like this get. Voyager Glidecar also pulls up from time to time, sometimes in that Boros deck because it eats a Gleeful Demolition nicely. It's a good turn 1 play, but more often it's in this like blue-white artifacts deck that we saw a little bit before Aetherdrift came out. And we're seeing increasingly now, although it still hasn't really caught a foothold in the format. But every now and again it shows up in league results or in challenges and stuff, and this is a pretty good addition, right? You want to keep your curve as low as possible in that deck, and even though Glidecar is not a 4-of in the deck or anything, it is still a pretty solid 2-of. A 1-mana 2/3 that's easy to crew and gets large throughout the game. That's a pretty good investment. But it has shown up, and it does count. Now, there's a couple of cards from Aristocrats that have shown up already this season. You know I'm excited about that. Aristocrats has 3 League 5.0s this season from different players, which I think is kind of important. It's not just the same, you know, lone soul banging out Aristocrats every week and like shouting from the top of the mountain where no one can hear them like, this is a good deck. I'm describing myself, but one way or the other, this deck has done some things this season, and it's mostly because we've been able to streamline it a good bit and cut down on its curve with cards like Gas Guzzler. This is not only a Savannah Alliance, incredibly, you know, efficient rate for a creature of this power in a deck like Aristocrats especially. You want to get in fast damage if you can, and this allows you to do that, especially if you go first, to get an attack or two in. But later on in the game, and really not that much later on in the game, this will start letting you draw cards on a sack outlet, something that aristocrats really didn't have access to in standard before now. We've got Zahura Glory's Pass to, sacrifice creatures once a turn and scry once a turn, surveil once a turn. And we've got stuff like Midnight Reaper to draw us cards if we can find another sack outlet, but it's just not often that you get a sack outlet that also draws cards, and you're more than willing to pay this extra mana. So this has been a fantastic get for aristocrats this season, but so has Zahura Glory's Past. I just brought this card up a second ago. I was a little bit skeptical about this card when it first came out, but it does come back with Erase the Past, which turned out to be one of the more important aspects of it, but it too is fairly well statted just at its baseline for the mana cost you're paying. And not only that, once you do have full speed, which I've established, not too hard to get in aristocrats because you're doing a bunch of damage to them turn over turn anyway. Once you have that, being able to sack a normal creature to get a 2/2 and then sack that 2/2 for more, Ellisil Core triggers or Vengeful Blood Witch triggers, this has just turned out to be extremely powerful. So I may have been wrong in going meh at Zahur when I first saw it. This card has actually been pretty solid for the aristocrats deck so far this season. But speaking of niche decks that are doing a little bit better this season, I brought up that blue-white artifacts deck earlier because of Voyager Glide card, but the more relevant cards in that deck have definitely been Mendicant Core Guidelight, as well as Voyage Home to an extent. That's why it gets the small slot on screen right now, is that I see a lot of Voyage Home on Arena, and I have seen it shown up in, a couple of League 5.0 blue-white artifact lists, but it is more often not there than it is there. In these winning lists, right? But again, every time somebody casts it against me on Arena, I'm pretty impressed by the card. But Mendicant Core Guidelight is much more, reliably spotted in these decks. This is often a 2 or 3 of, but it's a card that people just slap right down on the table as soon as they get it. And usually it is much larger in terms of power than you really want it to be. And that's honestly kind of a thing that the Artifacts deck needed. They go a little bit wide, but they barely ever get to go tall. That's one thing the Blue-White Artifact deck needed, is something non-dinky, aside from Zoetic Glyph, it can actually close games with, and this does help it do that. We've only got a couple of cards left in this section, and we'll start talking about some slightly heavier hitters, but I have seen Radiant Lotus show up exactly twice, both times as a silver bullet, so this card probably should have been a little bit farther down this list. Don't look at this video as a list. I tried to put all this in order, and I almost pulled the rest of my hair out. There's not much left. I need it. This has been in the, again, Teamer, sometimes is it, more often is it, Enigma Jewel deck. But again, it's just a one of, and even though there are some interesting combos with this in that deck, that deck's not really leaning on them too heavily, but I gotta admit that I didn't expect Radiant Lotus to see really any play throughout most of its standard tenure, right? I have to admit that it's a powerful looking card, but how often are we going to be in a situation where this card actually matters in standard? Well, it turns out it's already seeing play in the first 3 weeks of the set's release, so I was wrong about that. It's definitely not the most powerful card in the set in standard or anything like that, and it's showing up very sparingly, but I'm surprised it's here at all, so I have to give it some points. And finally, we got Web Strike Elite heading off this section here. This doesn't show up super often, and when it does, it's a 1 or 2 of, and when it does, it's in sideboards, but it's in those sideboards more often than a lot of these cards I've already talked about show up in main decks. And I am in some ways surprised that it's only a 1 or 2 of in boards. But again, we have mostly better options. Paw Patch Formation can be said to be a better option in a lot of spots. So I can see why it's not getting all the sideboard slots in the world, but it is getting a bunch. But now let's move up to second place on the podium here. I don't really have a snazzy name for this section or anything. I guess I didn't really for the first one either. Just show up sometimes. That's not very creative. So we'll just call this show up more often. With that in mind, let's look at Boom Mobile first. I do like the cars that go boom, and I'm a little bit surprised that other people do as much as they do. This has not only been in Teamer artifact-based decks with Simulacrum Synthesizer, but it's also shown up in these Izzet decks with Repurposing Bay and Simulacrum Synthesizer. But this is part of the Radiant Lotus combos that you see show up. If you can just get 1,000,000 mana with Radiant Lotus, you can just kill stuff. Them with a boommobile. That seems pretty good. So I don't know, man. I was a little like enamored with this when it first came out in previous season. Like, oh, what can we do with this? And it turns out that wasn't just me being dumb. I know that only happens like once in a blue moon. It turns out this card actually has like some relevancy, but when I do see it show up, it's usually just a 1 or maybe a 2 of. That said, I've seen it show up like way more often than any card we talked about in the first section, which really surprises me. But as much as I like the cards that go boom, I like the cards that go doom even more. Demonic Junker has shown up in these Grixis artifacts lists. You know, we've seen blue-white artifacts, we've seen Grixis artifacts, Is It artifacts. Somebody is going to figure out the perfect build for an artifacts deck soon, and I'm not sure which one it's going to be. That said, I have to sadly say that I'm pretty sure it's not Grixis. But that said, this deck does have, you know, access to not only Demonic Junker, but a few different cool and in a lot of cases very cheap black artifacts from Aetherdrift. So no surprise necessarily that like a 1-mana Ravenous Chupacabra is seeing play, but I would like it if it were seeing a little bit more play. That said, if Grixis artifact shows up in MTG 050 leagues or whatever, you know, if it shows up in league, then it's basically always going to include this card. There's also Burnout Bastronaut here, which has shown up in a couple of decks. Believe it or not, man, it's a neat little 1-drop goblin. It doesn't look bad or anything. I guess it's not. You know, it's shown up not only in the Goblins deck, which I'll focus a little bit more on later, because the deck has been actually pretty reliable this season, but it's not in every build of that deck, but it is in the Gruul Exhaust decks, which are really popular towards the beginning of the season, and you still see them every now and again, but this isn't the most important card in those decks, but it is a pretty often seen 1-drop. And then next, really kind of shocked by this one, but it's Chandra Sparkhunter. Chandra has shown up in a lot of red sideboards, again, not just mono red, but surprisingly, yes, does show up in mono red sideboards from time to time. It's not an Urabrass Forge or anything, but it is a creature factory, and decks tend to like stuff like that. This has shown up in the Duretti decks, and Duretti is not in this video because I haven't really seen a Duretti combo deck like even League 5.0. It's just kind of popular on Arena, but she is in those decks too, right? So this card has shown up in a number of, you know, sideboards over the first 3 weeks of the format, and again, I'm just kind of surprised and honestly kind of happy about it. I like my girl. But let's get back to this Gruul Exhaust deck so we can talk about Afterburner Expert here for a second. Afterburner Expert is basically the entire reason you play Gruul Exhaust. This card has been really good, right? If you have 2 copies of them, they can kind of loop themselves. Multiple copies of this card function really, really well together, but you need other stuff with Exhaust in your deck, which is where Draconautics Engineer comes in. Now, this, too, has shown up in a couple of different decks. This is in that Goblins deck that I swear we will talk about very soon, but apart from that, this again is in those Gruul Exhaust decks as well, and I've even seen it show up in like a random mono-red aggro list or two here and there, so Draconautics Engineer technically wins over Afterburner Expert in terms of like how much play it's actually seeing, but in the Gruul Exhaust deck, again, Expert is easily the most important card. We've also seen Grim Bauble show up a bunch in a few different decks. This is not only in those Grixis artifact decks. If you're playing Demonic Junker, you're playing a copy or 2 sometimes of Grim Bauble, but this shows up very often as just a Silver Bullet copy in these like Esper or Dimir Pixie decks. As a matter of fact, the less white is in your deck, I think the more likely you are to play Grim Bauble. You know, like if you're just Dimir Fear of Isolation with Storm Chaser's Talon or whatever and Hopeless Nightmare, then you're playing this card like most of the time, and I can definitely see why. It's not going to get, you know, brought back to your hand by this town like very often. It seems like there are probably much better options to use, and that's why the card is only a 1 of in most of the lists it's in, rather than the 2 or 3 of I thought it might end up being, right? But even all that said, it still does see play, and it does so fairly reliably. The card shows up a good bit. Next, we'll move on to Riptide Gearhulk, which has shown up in a fair number of like tap out blue-white decks, but it's also in this kind of like blue-white and occasionally Jeskai repurposing bay synthesizer kind of deck, right? This is a just fantastic 5-drop. If you can actually get to it in a game of Magic, it will do some real damage to the board state. So I'm not surprised to see this show up. Is it the 4 of I thought it might be in like an Azorius mid-range build, or maybe again like blue-white artifacts? It seems really good in that. No, it's not that. It's mostly just a 2 of, but you don't want to play too many 5-drops in your deck in Standard right now, so I can understand why, but the card is making an impact. I got to talk about Debris Beetle though, or simply Debreedle, if that's what you want to call it. It's faster, but this shows up as a 2 of very consistently in a Golgari kind of mid-range build. Golgari has like such ridiculous card quality right now that it's pushing a lot of even its best cards into, 2-of territory. So I'm not too surprised to see this being half a playset, but it does seem pretty efficient. That word was supposed to be efficient. My throat got dry halfway through the word. It was like, so sorry about that, but we'll move on to Spell Pierce here. I shouldn't spend too much time on this. It's been Magic cards since I was just a boy. Spell Pierce sees play in most standard environments it's part of, whether it comes out of the sideboard or more often it's in like tempo decks, and that is often where we see it nowadays. Not surprised to see this in various like green, blue, and blue-black Storm Chasers talent builds and stuff like that, but it's also occasionally in these like blue-white tempo aggro lists that pop up, which are surprisingly good this season, and Spell Pierce is probably a big part of that. This counters removal all the way up, from cut down to Sunfall for only a single mana, which has just always been a great rate. But I'll finish this section off with a couple of cards that are kind of cuspy, you know what I mean? Like, they're not quite gold hitters, but at the same time, these have been pretty reliable cards this season so far. Howl Squad Heavy is the first one I want to talk about. This is the key piece in the Goblins deck. Before this showed up, we didn't see Goblins in the queue whatsoever. We didn't see them in League 5-0s. We didn't see them in MTGO challenges. Now that this card is out, Krinko is seeing play. It's not even just like a super fast Goblins deck or anything. The deck plays a 4/4 drop like Krinko. So I'm a little shocked by that, to be honest. I didn't think that Heavy would be quite enough to make Krinko a playable card, but the results don't lie, dude. This shows up basically every day or every other day in MTGO League 5-0s, and sometimes it shows up more than once in the same league day, but it's also shown up in the top 8 of a tournament or 2 MTGO challenges so far this season, so I think it's about time to start taking this card seriously. And Goblins in general, but also, I've been talking about this card all video, I keep bringing it up, Repurposing Bay. This deck is in and out of fashion so far in the first 3 weeks. It wasn't a part of the first week like at all. The second week, it was a kind of Jeskai, sometimes blue-white synthesizer deck. You see Riptide Gearhulk in those, right? But this last week, it's been kind of an Izzet pile with that Enigma Jewel, right? And Boom Mobile and like all these super weird cards you don't very often see. There's a lot of like wild tricks with this, and I'm still pretty sure we haven't figured out the exact optimal build, but once someone does, I think they'll have a monster on their hands. Repurposing Bay has been nothing short of really impressive. But let's move into it. The gold hitters section, everybody. The gold all-star plus section here, where we talk about the absolute most played cards from Aetherdrift, and there's probably more of these than you might have assumed. So we'll start with Marauding Mako here. I got a comment on a video the other day by somebody who's trying to be a smart aleck. They were basically like, oh, well, I was covering the PT top 8. I'm pretty sure that's the comment this video, or the video this comment was on. And someone was like, oh, no Marauding Mako in the top 8? There's no Marauding Mako? Well, I haven't really seen it make a splash in Modern either. Well, then you haven't been looking, because it actually has made a pretty big splash in Modern. Not only did this spike the price of Goblin Lore by like 400% over the last week, but it's also shown up in like 6 different Modern, leagues over the past week as well, along with not just Goblin Lore, but Hollow One and a bunch of other discard spells. We can play Faithless Looting in Modern. That's cool, right? So this has really been making a splash. He says it's a fish. Well, a shark's not a fish. Well, maybe, yeah, it is. Okay, but a much more boring card, to be honest, that's been tearing up Standard is technically Bounce Off. People just stopped playing Unsummon. I like how we had a card from when I was 11 years old in the format for a few months, and people played it when Foundations came out, and like up until like Aetherdrift, where I was happy to play like a 2-of Unsummon in my tempo deck. So, I'm casting Unsummon. I'm 12 years old again, but no, we just got Bounce Off, a Mario Kart card. But you play it instead of Unsummon because it is literally strictly better. He said the thing. That's the name of the channel. But in this case, that's why it's the name of the channel, because it's actually a magic term. Speaking of dinky little 1-drops, Nesting Bot is also a really important card. I think you could make the argument in some ways this is one of the most important cards from Aetherdrift. And I guess I am doing that here because it's in the gold platinum section or whatever I ended up calling this. But yeah, Nesting Bot has been a little bit of everywhere. Not only is it in those Aristocrats decks I talked about earlier, which is not super relevant, but they are there. But they eat, a Gleeful Demolition better than basically any card in the entire format. So this has really rejuvenated the Jeskai and Boros, tokens decks, the Convokes decks, because on turn 2, if you Gleeful Demolition, this gives you 4 guys, and that really sets up the Recruiter turn or an attack with a Sanguine Evangelist or whatever you're trying to do. So Nesting Bot has been a real force. They really are everywhere too. I think I have a few in my comments section, but we'll move on to Dredger's Insight here, which is in a few decks actually. I was going to say it's in these Roots decks, and these Roots decks are trying so hard to make a comeback. They were really popular in the first couple of weeks, and we see them sort of falling off bit by bit as the season goes on, which honestly confuses me because they get League 5-0s fairly consistently, man, and they have a bunch of new cards, but Dredger's Insight is among them. Also, though, this card shows up in the blue-green Storm Chaser's Talent, This Town Ain't Big Enough kind of decks. Every now and again, people were playing Cash Grab over this to begin with, but now people mostly play Dredger's Insight, and you can see why. This card does an awful lot, right? Not only does it gain incremental life and kind of keep you in the game against aggro sometimes, even a couple of life can matter. So Dredger's Insight has been a really good card draw piece for those decks because, you can't pick up a Cash Grab and play it again for most intents and purposes in those decks. But there's also Momentum Breaker while we're talking about, Esper and Blue-Black Pixie decks and Fear of Isolation decks. This has shown up mostly as a 1-of and sometimes as a 2-of in those decks, but those decks are so popular that matters a great deal. Momentum Breaker has also been all over the arena, but I'm not really judging the arena too much in this video. I want actual results from MTGO, and this has shown up a bunch in those too. Also got to give some special attention to Monument to Endurance. Not only has this been a standard playable card, we've seen Boros Monument and Mardu Monument as well, which looks like a super fun deck that I have not gotten any reps in with, but I really want to. But there's been a bunch of different Monument to Endurance decks show up in Standard since the card came out. And there are even, artifact-based decks that aren't strictly Monument to Endurance decks that still play Monument to Endurance. I've seen it in these repurposing Bay decks from time to time. But this card gets super special mention because it's also shown up in Pioneer and Modern even in a couple of different builds. So this thing is not necessarily taking the world by storm, but just about every player in every format likes it now, whether you're in Standard, Pioneer, Modern, or even Commander. People are really dreaming up ways to break this card, and in some cases they've succeeded already. But a couple more lower rarity cards I want to look at because that's how it is, right? When a set comes out, often it's the lower rarity cards see the most play, and that is definitely the same for Aetherdrift. We got things like Rides In that are seeing 4-of play in the Pro Tour Champions deck. Rides In, again, they keep printing like really good versions of effects, like Bounce Off, just a better unsummon. And this, again, is just a better version of a bunch of effects that existed before it. But a card that has really been seeing play, I was tempted to make this like my quote number 1. Again, this isn't really a list, but I was kind of tempted to make this the last card we talked about. It's Stock Up over here, just a lowly little uncommon Dig Through Time. Just a little dig through time, as a treat, I guess. This card is seeing play all the way back to Legacy. Somehow. I guess because people will play Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise and stuff in Legacy, so why not play Stock Up? I know it looks pretty expensive and just like a slightly better divination. It is a strictly better divination in a lot of ways, but it's a slightly better divination. And how good is that actually? Well, it turns out ridiculously good. This is one of the biggest sleepers in the set, and it is really establishing dominance in a bunch of different places. But I guess I'll bring up a couple of other low rarity cards. Why not, man? We got to look at Memory Guardian, which is in basically every artifacts base build in the entire format. We looked at Mendicant Core earlier and Voyage Home, and we've looked at Nesting Bot, which is in those decks, Voyager Glide cards. Like, those decks got a lot of gas appropriately. This has been a 3-power evasive attacker for a single mana on turn 3 in most cases, and really kind of, again, forms the cornerstone of like every playable artifact deck in Standard at the moment. But there's also Molt Tender, which is in some ways been the most relevant uncommon, aside from, again, maybe Stock Up, in the entire set. This is in a bunch of decks that aren't necessarily just Insidious Roots based. Anything with Overlord of the Balemerc, which is a ton of decks right now, end up playing Molt Tender most of the time. This is basically a Deathrite Shaman that makes mana even easier on turn 2 than a Deathrite Shaman would. So yeah, it's no surprise that Moltender's seeing play, but it's seeing play in like 3 different lists right now. Again, don't think this is relegated to just Insidious Roots. It does a lot more, work than just that. I was going to say it does more labor than that, but that sounded... you just say work. But round in the corner, I've only really got like 4 more cards to touch on, and the next one is the Speed Demon. This is showing up in the Unholy Annex Dexes and Dexes. The Unholy Annexes Dexes. Sometimes the card draw this can lead to is just, literally unbelievable. You draw a card off of Annex and you draw 2 cards off of this, and suddenly you're just burying the opponent. They have to come up with a removal spell like right now, and if they don't, they're taking a bunch of damage, and you're just, again, you're burying them in cards. So Speed Demon has been phenomenal, and I hear it's a decent commander. Doesn't matter for this exercise, but I think it's getting a lot of love there as well. But still, it's showing up in Standard to say the least. But so is Bright Glass Gearhulk. This has been a godsend, the key piece for the Collector's Cage decks in this season. And Collector's Cage did show up in some pretty good numbers at the Pro Tour. Even though it didn't top 8, it's still doing a great job on MTGO leagues right now. Bright Glass Gearhulk gets a ton of important 1-drops for this deck, right? Everything from like Lano Relves to silver bullet copies of like Basilisk Collar, and that's like a super fun thing to be able to do in a deck. And again, just like Speed Demon, right? Not only does it give you cards, but it also gives you a pretty large threat that they have to deal with. So if they can deal with the cards, they have to deal with the threat. They deal with the threat, they have to deal with the cards. So an unbelievable pick for, again, mostly the Collector's Cage decks, but it wouldn't surprise me if during this thing's standard tenure, it found plenty of places to hang out. Next, I got to talk about Verges, which is our like next to last card here, and it's a little bit boring. We all knew these would show up, but these are by far maybe the actually most beneficial and relevant cards from the entire set, right? The red-white one seeing all the play in the world, the green-blue one seeing a ton of play, the green-black one is obviously seeing all the play. Just every single one of these was relevant and needed and necessary, so I'm glad we got them. But the last card we'll talk about today, I guess my number 1, which was also my number 1 card in the set. Look at that. It's Katramos over here. This is seeing a buttload of play in Standard. I want to point that out. This is seeing a fair number of, 5-0 league decks and stuff. And very often they're these like really wonky Agatha Soul Cauldron builds and stuff, but they don't always have to be. They can be a more kind of buttoned up Orzhov mid-range deck and still, win a, league for a day or whatever. But where this is showing up more often than Standard is Modern, baby. If you go look at basically any Modern league right now, you will see like 4 different versions, usually the same version, honestly, of the Katramos deck show up on the day. Just the other day, I think it was March 3rd, I think this deck had 5 copies in the top, or in League 5-0s. So Katramos, as a 4 of 2, is just wrecking face in Modern at the moment. But this is also seeing a ton of play in Pioneer, where we have a lot of effects that, jive well with the card. But even in Standard, where all we have is like Ghost Vacuums and Soul Cauldrons and stuff, this card is still seeing a ton of play, whether it's in the board or the main deck. This card is showing up. But that is Itsky Lewitsky. Let me know how you felt about all this, and if I missed anything, let me know down there in the comment section. Are you seeing cards in Standard or Modern leagues that I'm not seeing? I haven't really been checking out the Pauper leagues lately, so maybe I'm missing stuff that's showing up in Pauper. Just let me know what's seeing play from this set that maybe I didn't point out here. I don't know, dude. I feel like if you didn't give Aetherdrift a chance, or if you don't take it seriously in terms of power level because you hate the theme, then you might be missing out on something here. Chicken agrees. I don't know if you heard, but she was like, meow, at the end of that. Maybe she disagrees, but I don't know. I'm going to pretend my cats like me and think I'm smart. But what are cats for? But anyway, that's all I've got for this one. Just on your way out, do the YouTube stuff. Button shaped like a thumb. Funny bits. You can also sub to the sandwich. Hilarious. Or check out the Patreon, where, again, you get a special outro if you're a patron. Hey, patrons, wasn't that a good video? If it wasn't, let me know. You can be honest with me. Friends are honest with each other. And hey, I'll see you next time. But if you're everybody else, I'll also see you next time, I assume. If you made it to this part of the video, I just want to thank you for sticking out with me through the whole thing. That's great. Who watches to the end of a YouTube video? You can click off anytime you wanted to, and yet you haven't. That shows real dedication and commitment. I love you very much. But anyway, guys, that is Allski Kowalski. That's all I've got for this one. So I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, wizards. Spread love and be kind.